Would that be correct in saying that most of the counterintelligence stuff when it comes to propaganda really revolves around the internet?
Probably today. Left counterintelligence a long time ago, but we didn't have the internet back then. But I would imagine today there's a lot of that going on through the internet, through sources within TikTok. The way they would do it is recruit people that work for different internet providers or even YouTube channels, and then tap into that particular YouTube channel or TikTok channel and perform some type of counterintelligence operation. Back in my days, it was called deception operations. You didn't see anything written about disinformation. If you were going to operate a counterintelligence operation, it would be through deception, and similar to what we did with Paul Benowitz, although that really wasn't much of a task with us because Paul was already a believer in UFOs, so we didn't have to go through any great lengths to make him believe what he was seeing were UFOs and not the secret operation that he actually tapped into. So Paul lived in what they call the area called Four Hills in eastern Albuquerque. The Four Hills housing complex was right up against the base perimeter of Kirtland Air Force Base. In fact, Paul's house, if you went out his backyard and walked up to the fence, his fence, there was a buffer zone of about maybe 100 feet, and then the base fence was there. So Paul could look right in to see Monsanto. And so Paul told Colonel Edwards that he was receiving strange signals from there, and also he was filming strange objects flying next to military aircrafts. When that was reported to Colonel Edwards, he immediately contacted me. I was a counterintelligence officer of the base, and he said, "Hey, Rick, I got some guy here is providing information to me that you need to hear." So I immediately went to Colonel Edwards' office. He gave me all the information on Paul, and then I made contact with Paul. That was early 1980, and that's when the operation began. Paul didn't come out and speak with the Air Force personnel until sometime later.
Were you kind of tasked by your superiors to give this deception to Paul Benowitz, or was this something just like on your own accord, like just reinforcing his own preconceived thoughts and ideas he already had?
No, within the U.S. intelligence community, you didn't walk across the street and get a drink of water without an operations plan. When my first objective was to gather all the information that Paul had, I didn't say or try to trick Paul in anything until I gathered all the information that he gave to Colonel Edwards. And so I went out and met with Paul a couple of times to get everything that he'd had and that he was reporting. I never provided anything to Paul until maybe the third or fourth time I went back out there. But when I came back to the office, I wrote up my report and reports and sent them up to our headquarters. And then they sent me down a proposed operational plan of what I need to do. And I followed the plan. I did exactly what they told me to do. And that's how I started interfacing with Paul.
Did you know that what he was capturing was advanced military technology that was being tested around Kirtland Air Force Base, and that he was getting transmissions from the base before you went to figure out what he had? Was that already the thought and the idea behind the Air Force at that time, that he had footage or he was recording signals from the military base?
Well, what Paul was doing was he was photographing these objects flying around military planes, and what he was actually photographing was a highly classified experimental military drone program. They were testing different drones back in those days, and the one way that the drones were tested was the military aircraft would fly a certain flight pattern and release those drones directly from the aircraft. And because the aircraft, the controllers inside that aircraft had to control those drones, those drones flew in close proximity to these Air Force aircrafts. Well, Paul was photographing that, thinking those things were UFOs. And when he told us and showed me the film, there were other agents involved in this. My name came up, Jerry Miller's, Steve Atz, and some others. So we gathered all that information and gave it, sent it up. And then that's when the Air Force says, you're going to have to convince them that those things are something else. And since Paul was a believer in UFOs, he was a MUFON investigator. He's been one for a number of years. He was actually involved with NICAP prior to MUFON. And so he was a believer. And he told us those things are UFOs. Those things are alien aircrafts. So it wasn't difficult for me to convince him. All I had to say was, okay, I believe you, Paul. They probably are. That's it. Easy job. Now, the other thing he was doing was on the base, we had an NSA facility that had two laser systems. And what these lasers were doing were shooting a laser up in the sky every time a Soviet aircraft would pass over and point that laser into the lens of that passing Soviet satellite and blinding the satellite. We had several of them in the United States. And Paul had tapped into those signals using to control that laser. That's how NSA got involved in it, and National Security Agency. And so that's what we did during the investigation. Now, there were a lot of other parts of the Paul Benowitz case, but that was the primary, and it was directed and driven by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and they dictated what we were to do and how we were to do it.
When did you figure out, I guess you personally, or maybe the Air Force already knew that the NSA was involved with Paul Benowitz? Was this further down the road or earlier when you were in contact with him?
I had no idea they were. One night I was at Paul's house with another agent, and we were up in Paul's upper patio. It was a rainy night, so we were inside upstairs, and we were looking across the street. And as I looked across the street at this house, directly across the street from him, I saw a little red light in the window. And I thought, hey, Paul, who lives over there? I think they got a camera on pointing over here. And Paul says, nobody lives over there. That's a vacant house. I thought, wow, that's odd. So we watched it for a while, and I thought, well, somebody's photographing this house. So we were federal agents and we carried guns. And so we went down, but I called Albuquerque Police Department, and I had contacts there, and I asked for a couple officers to come out. We walked across the street just as these two men were coming down the steps and going to a car. Albuquerque police stopped and asked them what they were doing. They said, well, they're renting this place. And then I stepped in. I said, you renting this place? He said, yeah. I said, where are you guys out of? He said, well, none of your business, kind of. So I identified myself and Steve Atz, the other agent with me. And that pretty much turned the Albuquerque police turned that over to us. And they said, well, we're here. We're out of Colorado Springs. I said, what are you doing down here? Why are you filming that house across the street? He said, well, I can't tell you that. It's classified. So, but they did identify themselves finally as NSA agents. So the next day or a day after, I immediately went out to the NSA facility and I had contacts out there and met with one of their supervisors. And I said, why the hell are you guys involved with an investigation that we're doing? And he said, well, I can't tell you that. I have to get, you have to get clearances and so forth. So like a day or two later, he called me up and said, you can come out and we'll brief you on it. And then he briefed us on what they were doing. And they were concerned about the signals that Paul was getting from the laser systems. I knew the laser system was out there. I mean, I knew everything because I was a counterintelligence officer. I knew everything that was on the base, but I didn't actually know every aspects of those things. So then I said, okay, so that's why you guys are investigating. But they went beyond, way beyond that. They actually implanted listening devices and other bugs inside Paul's home without telling us. And we would find them. We had technical people that would come out and sweep Paul's house all the time because we also had an espionage investigation going against one of Paul's employees. Paul owned the Thunder Scientific Laboratories right outside Kirtland. He was making parts for Minuteman missiles, warheads, and U.S. Navy submarines. And so we got information on somebody that might be providing data to the Chinese. That was turned over to the FBI eventually. But we would go out, our technical specialists would go out and sweep Paul's house for signals all the time. And they found these NSA bugs, which, number one, were not legal. We had a contract with Paul, a written contract the Air Force had with Paul Benowitz, because Paul wanted this thing investigated. And so Paul agreed to the contract, and everything that we did was in that contract. Paul allowed us to go into his home anytime we wanted to or needed to. We could collect data from his home. He knew what type of bugs we placed in his home. We knew he knew that his phone was being monitored, and he had two different phone systems or numbers, different phone numbers, and we had both of those bugged. He knew that. That's why at the end of this investigation, people always ask me, why didn't Paul sue you guys? Because we had a contract with him. Everything was written down, and we did everything according to that contract. So Paul, agreed to it because he wanted to know exactly what these aliens were doing, and he thought that we were collecting all that data. So, but NSA didn't have one with him, so they surreptitiously entered his home to place these bugs. One in the computer, and he had another one, a couple other ones. So we found him and we took him out, and we took him back and gave him to NSA and said, next time you do something, you need a warrant or a permission.
What did Paul think about these bugs that you guys were finding that wasn't your guys' bugs? What did he say about that?
Well, this is one of the mistakes I think I made. If I had to do it over again, I wouldn't do it this way. We didn't tell Paul initially. We found these bugs, and number one, one of the reasons our supervisor told us not to tell Paul was we didn't know who placed these in there at that time. We thought they might be Soviets, Russian, Chinese. So our technical security specialists got the bugs and they analyzed them. And when they analyzed them and found out that they were NSA bugs, we didn't tell Paul initially that they were NSA bugs, but we took them back to NSA. At some point later on, we did tell Paul, but not initially. And I think if I had to do it all over again, I would immediately told Paul. But that's a mistake I made in that investigation. We didn't initially, when we found him, tell Paul that.